everybody. Welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, joined here by Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. And thanks for joining us here on the network, where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. And speaking of live, let's talk about what we have on the agenda for today. Good old Claudia. All right, let's talk about it right now with Law and Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, she wanted to get on the stand and have her opportunity to explain in her words how awful of a marriage she was in, that she was a victim herself of emotional and mental abuse. Her defense attorneys really thought that this was going to work, huh?
She was trying to mount what we call a justification defense, right? This was sort of she wanted to present a battered woman defense, which could, if successful, justify killing her spouse. But Jesse, it fell so short. What she describes on the stand are things that, she got mad at her husband for. It wasn't the type of abuse that really lent itself to that type of defense, and hence the jury came back with a very quick guilty verdict.
How could it have worked?
She needed expert testimony. She needed, years of psychological records, years of police records, years of that coupled with an expert testimony, and then maybe she would have been able to present a valid defense.
When we were covering this case, one of the things that we saw was there was a plan to put forward a battered women syndrome, but I don't think they could quite get an expert to testify to that in this case.
Which is very telling. Like, the jury would never know this, but I know, and you know as attorneys, if you can't pay somebody to say what you want them to say, and I don't mean it like that, it's you pay an expert to analyze your case. If they can't come back and say, you're right, I can testify to this, you're out of luck.
Or maybe they spoke to him and then just said, you know what, maybe this isn't the strongest defense to go forward. But really what they did was they put her on the stand and they said, just speak. Just say everything you're going to say.
Which is very risky. But they really didn't have much of a choice. The evidence from the prosecution side was really compelling. I mean, she bought the gun very soon before she killed him. I mean, there was just such a chain of evidence favorable to the prosecution here.
I mean, really, when you break it down, the idea that she bought the gun, she practiced with the gun, she shot him, she admitted to shooting him at close range for one final shot, and then fled to Brazil. The fleeing was the big part there.
Well, you can always say that that's indicia of guilt. Look, she had a good run. She was free as a bird for 11 years. Now she's going to be serving 28 with the possibility of parole that she'll never get. But
during the victim impact statements, one of the family members of Carl Hoerig said she was free to live her life for 10 years. She got married in Brazil after murdering somebody.
Which says a lot about that husband, doesn't it?
I don't know anything about the marriage. All I know is that this was pretty remarkable.
It was.
And we don't always see cases quite like this. But we're going to talk more about it. So let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll have a lot more to discuss here on Law and Crime. Folks, as we wait for our live feeds of the day, we're talking about the Claudia Hoerig trial. What a trial it was. And really, one of the most remarkable moments is when Claudia Hoerig took the stand. Now, we weren't surprised that the defendant herself took the stand because she was very vocal throughout this whole process, complaining about her jail conditions. She complained that she wouldn't get a fair trial here in the United States. And in fact, we believe that after her sentencing, she is in the middle of writing a letter criticizing the media and also directed to Carl Hoerig's family. If we should get that letter, we're going to make sure to read it and talk to you more about it. But in the meantime, let's talk about Claudia Hoerig on the stand. We just played you some of her on direct, talking about the kind of marriage she was in, where she said she was in an abusive marriage, that she was forced to do things she didn't want to do. She was emotionally abused. At one point, she talks about that Carl Hoerig caused her to have a miscarriage. But what happened when she was on cross-exam by the state? I'll give you a clue. Fireworks. Take a look.
Well, let's go down a different avenue here. Before you shot Carl Hoerig, you were upset that he had an engagement party for you at Put-in-Bay, correct?
I thought that was very weird. That was a sign that something...
Yes or no? I'm not asking for an explanation. All I want to know is yes or no. Before you shot him, you were upset that he had an engagement party for you at Put-in-Bay.
No, it has no connection with that. You're confused.
You were not upset with him about that?
No.
Okay. Before you shot him, you were upset that you married him after only 50 days of dating?
No.
No.
I wasn't mad about that.
You weren't mad about that. Before you shot him, were you upset that he trapped you or tricked you into marrying him?
No, I think waiting for stuff.
Yes or no?
No.
Okay. Before you shot Carl Hoerig, were you upset that he threw away that one fetus that you had and threw it away?
I was upset at that day, yes, at the time.
Okay. Before you shot him, were you upset that he made you train and run in the woods while you were pregnant?
I was upset at that day, yes.
Okay. Before you shot him, were you upset that he looked at those pornographic websites?
Well, that was his problem.
Before you shot him, were you upset that he picked out the clothes you wore?
I didn't realize at the time that...
Yes or no? All I want to know is yes or no. These are simple questions.
I didn't like that very much.
And before you shot him, were you upset that he made you wear only open-toed high heels?
I didn't like that.
Okay. Before you shot him, were you upset he made you walk around the house naked in high heels at night?
Yeah, I didn't like that.
All right. Before you shot him, were you upset he had some weird sexual fetishes, according to you?
Yeah, I didn't like that.
Okay. And you agree, at this point, that Carl Hoerig cannot come in here and explain any of these situations that you testified to, correct?
Yes, he can through the voice recordings.
No, he can't. He can get on this witness stand.
He's testifying. Don't testify, Mr. Hoerig. Go ahead.
Well, can Carl Hoerig come in this courtroom and testify?
No.
Okay, thank you. Can Carl Hoerig come in this courtroom and dispute or admit or deny anything you've said to this detective or to this court yesterday?
Okay, Jonna, now I know sometimes a jury doesn't like when an attorney can be very combative with a witness, let alone the defendant.
Right.
But it didn't really, it worked here, didn't it?
It worked and it didn't. It worked because we know what the verdict is, but it didn't for me, Jesse, because it kind of was a little unnecessary. I mean, I think all the prosecution was going for here was he wanted to repeat, before you shot him 8,000 times, just to drill home with the jury that they were looking at a woman who shot her husband. And then the questions were, you pretty much shot him for very innocuous reasons, right? Because he made you wear open-toe shoes and you didn't like that, or he made you walk around the house naked before bed and you didn't like that. Again, trying to prove the point that this did not rise to the level of justification.
Well, wasn't it also to show that she planned it out? She was angry for quite some time.
Well, yeah, that's what the prosecution was going for, that this wasn't justified. This was just her being upset over things that, like, again, pretty innocuous. It wasn't like, oh, you got mad at him when he punched you in the nose 82 times, you know, during the course of your marriage.
Aside from her claim that maybe he pushed her against the wall or was a little physical, there was no physical abuse in this relationship alleged by her. So it would never have worked. You correct me, if there's no physical abuse, can you ever have a self-defense argument like that?
You can, if she were so emotionally abused, but that is a level, when you're talking about emotional abuse, Jesse, it has to be extreme.
Like what?
And we don't really have here. Well, look at this case. She tried to say that he said to her, I wish you would kill yourself, or I'm paraphrasing, you know, the day of this event. She tried to say that that was extreme. You don't wish somebody to kill themselves, and that just set her off.
Well, according to her, she threatened to kill herself. When she confronted him about killing herself, he goes, well, if you're going to do it in the basement so you don't get any blood on the artwork.
Right. So he was being very flippant about it, and that set her off. Does that alone rise to the level of emotional abuse that would justify this? No way. But if he were doing something like that daily, and she were getting help for it, and we could prove that, then she might have had a case.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. We want to watch more of her under cross-examination, so let's continue on with Claudia Hoerig.
A few days before you purchased that .357 handgun, you transferred $9,900 to Brazil.
Objection. That's not the evidence. Is that the right number? It was the same day. Okay, the same day?
The same day you shot and killed Carl Hoerig, you transferred $9,900 to Brazil?
No.
You said same day you purchased the handgun.
No, I said that. Let me rephrase this.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase this.
In the end, it's up to the jury to determine what the testimony was. But go ahead and ask your question.
A few days before you bought the .357 on March 10th, may have been March 7th, 8th, 9th, I don't know, you transferred $9,900 to Brazil. Is that correct?
I bought the gun.
Yes or no?
No, that's not correct.
Okay. Did you transfer $9,900 to Brazil before you killed Carl Hoerig?
Yes.
Okay. On March 10th, that Saturday, 2 days before you shot Carl Hoerig, you went to Slugmasters and bought a .357 handgun, correct?
On Friday. Friday.
Well, March 10th.
It was Friday? What?
Well, I'm not going to get into an argument about whether it was Friday or Saturday. March 10th was, according to my calendar, a Saturday. If you want to call it a Friday, that's fine. But on March 10th, which was 2 days before you shot him, you bought a .357.
I'm not sure if it was the 10th or the 9th. Yes, I did buy it before I shot him, of course.
Well, may I approach the witness and refresh her memory with the purchase that she made?
And this is just a taste of the back and forth between the defendant and the cross. It was pretty exciting to watch. Jonna, the thing that catches my attention for listening to this is if she didn't buy the gun beforehand, if she didn't test fire a gun, if she didn't send money to Brazil, if she didn't run to Brazil, and she shot him and stayed and called the police, would this have been a very different trial?
Oh, I think so. Not to say that she would have not been found guilty of anything or not been tried at all, but it could have, what it probably would have been is the lesser charge of manslaughter, which would have her seeing the light of day at some point, most likely.
And you believe that because a lot of times we see trials where the defense will say, hey, if this was a murder, they would have ran away. No, they called police. But that doesn't always work. Here you're saying, based upon the circumstances, if it was alleged correctly, she could have mounted a successful defense to get it dropped to manslaughter.
Probably, but there was so much evidence on the prosecution side. I mean, and the fact that she fought coming back here to the States. It was rare. She probably thought, Jesse, that she was never going to be compelled to come back to the United States and face the music. So she was sipping Mai Tais with her new husband in Brazil, and this was all a big shock to her.
The thing that the judge pinned on, and something we pinned on as well, is that she never seemed remorseful. She cried about her family in Brazil, but she never shed one tear for Carl Hoerig.
And, you know, and I'll defend her on that, only because there's such a big gap. Like, we forget, this murder didn't happen yesterday. It happened almost a dozen years ago.
She cried about her family from 2007.
Well, let's just say this. People who
I'm making a good argument here.
As you always do. People who shoot their husbands aren't in love with them. So I wouldn't expect her to be all boo-hoo about it on the stand in this case.
Well, I mean, we also know that on the plane ride back to the United States, she was speaking to those officials and said, justifying her shooting of their husband as well.
This woman had some loose lips, and she says things that are a little bizarre. Like after she got to prison, she was worried about her toenails, Jesse. I mean, come on.
Well, she, didn't think that the conditions in the jail were suitable for her. The question for her is, she really wanted to get her side of the story out.
She did. And they needed to, though. Without an expert, they had to put this woman on the stand. They had to let her talk. I'm sure her defense attorneys were doing this the entire time, and she didn't help herself.
Was the highlight for you when she said she couldn't get a fair trial in the United States and said this in an open court in front of the judge and the jury? That she would have gotten a fair trial in Brazil?
She'd get a fair trial in Brazil because nothing happened in Brazil. But yeah, I mean, again, she didn't help her case at all.
And I want to get more into the extradition with you because this is rare to have somebody extradited back to the United States to face a trial like this.
Well, from that country. And it took some great effort by a politician here in the United States. And maybe because her husband was in the military, this was something that didn't sit well with the people of this community, that she was literally going to get away with murder.
Because under Brazilian law, she couldn't be sent back to the United States to face criminal charges. We'll talk about that saga in a little bit, but when we come back, let's talk more about that extradition flight and what Claudia said to the officials. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're still talking about the Claudia Hoerig trial. What a trial we covered here on Law and Crime, and we saw the conclusion last week with her sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years. But before we even get there, one of the things we were talking about before our last break is that Claudia Hoerig really wanted to tell her side of the story at all points throughout this legal process, and really, the first time we heard her really talk about it was on that extradition flight back from Brazil to the United States. and she had a lot to say to the people on board, including to Anthony Sano, who's a retired FBI special agent. Let's see what he had to say about what Claudia had to say.
Did you have any specific instructions as to what you were to do as part of the escort to bring her back to the United States?
Yes, we were asked, and this is delivered to me by Deputy U.S. Marshal Bill Bolton, that your office, the prosecutor's office, asked that we not interrogate her and therefore not Mirandize her.
And what happened, in your own words, on that flight back, if anything was said by her, and tell the jury how that occurred?
We had a lot of conversation on the plane about typical stuff, her upbringing, her education. She asked questions about my family, my wife, how I became an FBI agent. Many times peppered throughout that, she would start to bring up, she would make the comments, I have a story to tell, but I don't want to tell it because I don't want to hurt Carl's family. And I would just tell her, look, I can't ask you any questions about what happened between you and your husband. So just wait until we land, and then you can tell your story all you want. This happened a number of times. Well, pretty far into the flight, I'm going to say it was maybe 6 hours into the flight, if I remember correctly. He started to walk away. She said she shot him 3 times, believing the first one hit him in the head, and the other 2 hit him in the back. She realized she killed him, so she had said she had created this suicide block, a suicide rig, as we refer to it, that would help her pull the trigger. She tried to kill herself, pulled the trigger twice. Each time the round didn't go off. At this point, she called her father, spoke to her father, a friend, her father in Brazil, by the way, a friend and an attorney, and they instructed her that she needed to leave the country because she would certainly be charged with murder and get the death penalty, and that Brazil would.
Okay, so John, I got to ask you, the truth of the matter is she probably was not familiar with our judicial system, and her rights she did not have to say anything to these officials, but she opened up. That's alarming, isn't it?
Well, I'm very curious to know whether when she started opening up on this flight, where clearly she was not free to leave, Jesse, did they say to her, stop talking, you have a right to an attorney? Did they Mirandize her basically on this flight? I'm going to assume that they didn't, because now they get to regurgitate the entire conversation that she had with him, which doesn't help her. What this officer's testifying to does not help her.
When they took her from Brazil to the United States, she has those rights, correct? Those rights are, she can be Mirandized. Everything is still the same as it would be if she was arrested in the United States. You
still have all those rights. And you have to be told of those rights. And clearly, when you're in an airplane, you are not free to leave, even if you have a parachute.
Well, obviously, Anthony Sano is not the only person that she spoke to. She also spoke to Bill Bolden, a U.S. Marshal who was on that flight. Let's see what he had to say.
As we continued on the lengthy flight, she began to tell her story, a version of events as to what occurred when she was involved or when she shot her husband, Carl Hoerig. She stated that on the day that the incident occurred, that she had informed Carl that she was pregnant, Mr. Hoerig, that she was pregnant, and that they had gotten into a heated argument. She stated that he went to take a shower and locked the bedroom door so she could not get in. She then stated that she was standing in the hallway, and when he exited the bedroom, she put the gun to her head and threatened to shoot herself. She said Carl responded by telling her to go ahead and kill herself, but to go to the basement so he did not get blood on his carpet and on the walls and the paintings in the hallway.
Okay, I want to talk to you about suicide. If this is true, and we believe that at least one of those suicide attempts where she took pills and then actually drove off the side of the road is true, how does that play into this kind of case?
So she apparently wanted people to believe, whether the jury or the investigators, that her husband was so unsympathetic that he essentially encouraged her to kill herself. The way I interpret that testimony is that her husband did not believe that she was genuinely in a state where she was going to take her own life, and this is how they argued. So he flippantly said, don't make a mess up here, go make a mess in the basement, not believing that she had any intention of killing herself. And Jesse, here's something that really sticks with me. Why a laser sight? If you're going to kill yourself, if you buy a gun for the intention of ending your own life, God forbid, what do you need the laser sight for?
John, it's funny you should say that, because one of the jurors after the verdict, the guilty verdict, came back and said, why do you need that laser sight if you're going to kill yourself? And maybe also, why do you need target practice? You know, one of the conversations that she had on the stand was she's not an expert in how to kill yourself and how to fire the gun, and she was very concerned that if she fired it the wrong way, she'd mess up the suicide. Did you buy that argument?
Not at all. And listen, and I don't really want to get into a dissertation about how easy it is to end your life with a gun. I would never want to encourage anybody to do that. You're in a horrible state of mind to do that. She was grasping. She is trying to find any reason whatsoever to justify something that simply was not justifiable.
She's been in Brazil for years, and some people were wondering whether or not she had opportunity to craft her story. What would you say to them?
To the people who she told her tall tale
to the people who say, hey, listen, she crafted her story for all those years. If she ever got caught, she knew what she was going to say.
You know what I say to them? I say she probably crafted her story before she pulled that trigger.
Do you believe
she just
that?
had many years to brush up on it.
Because the idea is, when did premeditation start? When was this done with prior calculation? When she bought the gun, or do you think...
We could easily argue that. The second she decided to buy that gun is when the premeditation started.
It's a lot to talk about.
Oh, my goodness.
With Claudia Hoerig, a lot to talk about. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to show you the conclusion of the case with the verdict. We'll be right back. Everybody, so we've been talking about Claudia Hoerig, a trial that we covered here on Law and Crime, and we're coming to the conclusion. So Claudia Hoerig was charged with aggravated murder in connection with the shooting death of her husband, Carl Hoerig, back in March of 2007. She then fled to Brazil, where she remained for 10 years, and she was finally extradited back to the United States, where she faced a criminal trial. That whole legal process to get her back was interesting. The highest Supreme Court, the highest court in Brazil, ultimately said that she had renounced her Brazilian citizenship. They stripped it away from her, and she was brought back here. Her defense was that she was the victim, that she was in a terrible marriage where she was forced to do things she didn't want to do, that Carl Hoerig was emotionally abusive, and really she couldn't take it anymore. In fact, she accuses Carl Hoerig of being the reason why she had 2 miscarriages. Well, the jury had a determination here. Would they find her guilty or not? Would they find her guilty of something less? Would they find her not guilty? Well, if you haven't seen the conclusion of the Claudia Hoerig case, take a look at the verdict.
The jury in this case, duly impaneled and sworn or affirmed, find the defendant, Claudia C. Hoerig, guilty of aggravated murder as she stands charged in the first count of the indictment, dated this date, signed by all 12 jurors. As to the specification, we, the jury, in this case, duly impaneled and sworn or affirmed, find the defendant, Claudia C. Hoerig, did, at the time of committing aggravated murder, have a firearm on or about her person under her control, brandished the firearm, indicated that she possessed it or used it to facilitate the offense, again, dated this date, and signed by all 12 jurors. Ms. Fowler, did I properly read the verdict of your jury? Anything further from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Anything further from the defendant?
No, Your Honor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, again, without...
Jonna, do you think it was tough for the jury to come to that decision?
Oh, no. I think it was a pretty quick and simple verdict that they came to. And frankly, Jesse, the correct one.
Never easy to decide the fate of anybody's life, but maybe this case was easier for some than others. Then we had to move into sentencing. What would her sentence be? And one of the things that the prosecution did was put out the victim impact statements from family members of Carl Hoerig. And the first person we heard from was Paul David Hoerig, who was Carl Hoerig's brother. Let's see what he had to say.
I'm Paul Hoerig, Carl's younger brother. Words cannot express the pain and anguish my family has endured since Carl's murder. Claudia's decision to needlessly take my brother's life with no regard for the effects it would have on others is unimaginable. The loss of my brother is beyond words. The fact Claudia so arrogantly fled to a foreign country after killing my brother has been both heartbreaking and frustrating. Knowing Claudia selfishly went on with a normal life, starting a business and getting remarried as if nothing had happened, is difficult for me to comprehend. She lived free and in the open for over 9 years while my family and I struggled to have her detained. This nightmare was followed by almost 2 years of her filing numerous appeals to stay in Brazil. Her selfish and deceptive actions of playing games with her U.S. citizenship to maintain her freedom in Brazil reveals her true character. This agreement was necessary to secure her extradition. I believe we should honor this agreement. Therefore, I fully support the prosecutor's recommendation of 25 years to life, plus 3 years for the gun specification. Carl was a man of honor, and he would have wanted us to honor this agreement. With that said, when the time comes, I, along with other family members, will be there to meet with the parole board to demand Claudia is treated like all other inmates. I will be there to tell Carl's story. Under the conditions, Claudia accepts full responsibility and is a model inmate. I will support parole at 30 years. I wish to express my sincerest gratitude for allowing me this opportunity to speak on behalf of my family.
Now, Jonna, she was ultimately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years. The way the judge came to that was there was an agreement between the United States and Brazil that the max they could sentence her to was that term, and it's 25 years is actually based upon the aggravated murder, but you add 3 years for the firearm specification, so 28 years. Do you think she could get parole in almost 30 years? And remember, she's 54 years old right now.
I was just going to say, she's no spring chicken, right? So 28 years is a long time. And at that point, she'll be quite old, assuming she lives that long. So sometimes when you're that old, you can get a little leniency from the parole board, but you have to remember what got her here. She took off to begin with. If she gets parole, she could take off again, even though she's going to be, whatever, in her 70s or 80s at that time. So I think it's doubtful that she'll get parole.
We believe that she is going to appeal.
Of course.
Is there any successful way she can appeal this case?
I don't know what her grounds for appeal are going to be, unless, like, for example, maybe there is an appealable issue for the fact that she was not able to put an expert on the stand. Did the judge have anything to do with that? And maybe the judge made a bad call there, and she could get another trial in the future.
She had also mentioned these series of recorded messages of Carl Hoerig that weren't allowed in. Somehow they're in Brazil. We don't know if they exist. We don't really know the details of it, but who knows if that's an avenue as well. My question is that if the judge wasn't restricted by this agreement, and he could determine to sentence her to life in prison without parole, do you think he would have done that in light of all the factors in this case?
There would be no reason to do anything but that. I mean, really, when you look at this, cold-blooded killing, premeditated killing of a man who she should have divorced, not murdered.
And you hear the family who've been suffering for so long, they finally have their opportunity to speak out against her.
Yeah, they did, and that was pretty compelling, too. And this man, his brother, seemed to be very fair. He's like, I'll support parole if she's a model prisoner. That was, I don't know, classy.
And he said, I will be there. And most of them said Carl would have wanted this sentence to respect what the U.S. government did, and that's a big point to all of them. Jonna Spilbor, thanks so much for coming on.
Jesse, always good to be with you. This is one tough case to cover, I got to tell you.
But I appreciate your insight nonetheless.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.